Alright, so this is Islamic World Part 2. This is Part 2 of a three-part series on Islam in the medieval period. And in this lecture, we're going to look at the spread of Islam in Arabia and Persia and the East. Alright, so at the end of the first lecture, we looked at this Muslim idea of the Umma, right? That all Muslims are kind of united in this worldwide community. And after Muhammad's death, the Ummah was united under a series of caliphs. And the first four caliphs, or the so-called rightly guided caliphs, were all men who were either related to Muhammad or had served in Muhammad's early military campaigns. But after the death of the fourth rightly guided caliph, the Umayyad clan, and this is the same Umayyad clan who controlled Mecca at the time of Muhammad's birth. This is the same Umayyad clan who originally tried to stop Muhammad from, spreading his word and his ideas. Eventually, the Umayyads took control of the caliphate, or the Muslim empire, and they began conquests of North Africa, Mesopotamia, Persia, India, and Southeast Asia. And this was a series of jihads, right? Jihad literally just means the struggle in Arabic, but these were holy wars to spread Islam by force, right? Very similar to the Christian Crusades that would come a few centuries later. The expansion of the Umayyad Caliphate also brought about a lot of the destruction of Zoroastrianism in Persia and Mesopotamia. Now, of course, the Zoroastrians remain and are still there, but under the Umayyad Caliphate, Zoroastrianism went from being the state religion of Persia to being very much a minority religion. Now later on, there would be a split in Islam, and this is very important because it still affects the religion today. Fights over who would be the next caliph and who would lead the Ummah led to a couple of key murders. The murder of Uthman, who was an Umayyad caliph, as well as Ali, who was Muhammad's son-in-law. This would cause a split in Islam between the Sunni Muslims, who were the Umayyads, kind of the main group, the established group, the group that was more interested in law, the group that is much more powerful in the western part of the Muslim world, places like Saudi Arabia and Syria, in Iraq, and the Shi'a Muslims, who are the smaller group. They tend to be more mystical, much more emotional, and their power tends to be centered now in Iran. And this split between Sunni and Shia still causes a lot of religious violence throughout the Muslim world. And so it's something to be very aware of. But there's continued Muslim expansion throughout this time. The Umayyads shifted their capital to Damascus, which is in Syria. And the Muslims continued to expand north into the Iberian Peninsula, which is now modern-day Portugal and Spain. The Muslims also expanded into the Balkans region, which is now Turkey, Serbia, Croatia, southern Romania, parts of Hungary, right? And this, set about a series of conflicts between Muslims and Christians for land, resources, money, and converts. It was this expansion that would kind of provide the starting point for the Christian Crusades in the 11th century. Eventually, though, the Umayyads declined, right? The caliphs became soft and immoral. They started to lose their way. And the Ummah began to splinter. And attacks on the eastern parts of the Umayyad lands, places that are now like Afghanistan, by nomad warriors from further north, and strong religious believers, kind of similar to today's Taliban, ultimately caused the Umayyad Caliphate to collapse. And those groups who expanded from the east, primarily Afghan warriors, but also Turks and Persians, were led by those who claimed descent from Muhammad's uncle, a man named Al-Abbas, and they became known as the Abbasids. and they marched on the Umayyads and destroyed their weak and corrupt caliphate. The Abbasids were also supported by non-Arab Muslims who felt disrespected by the Umayyads. The feeling was that only Arabs could be Muslims, and the Abbasids changed that, and so Turks and Persians and other Muslim groups became much more powerful in the Abbasid caliphate, and the Abbasids moved their capital to Baghdad. Now, as modern Americans, I think we usually think of Baghdad as this war-torn, destroyed city, but in the medieval period, Baghdad was arguably the most sophisticated city in the world in terms of its art, and science, and literature, and wealth. And the Abbasids brought in more Persian administrators, bureaucrats and government leaders and scholars. The Persians had been an empire for a long time, and the Persians knew how to run a big empire, and the Abbasids hired a lot of Persians for that reason. And as I mentioned before, the Abbasids were much more multicultural. They were much more accepting of non-Arab Muslims. And as we know, as I've talked about before, and as is a dominant theme in this course, multicultural empires are just more powerful. They have a bigger variety of ideas and know-how, and they become stronger because of it. And the Abbasid Caliphate is just another example of that. Under the Abbasids, the Umma experienced great advancements in science and technology, engineering, and mathematics. A lot of advancements in sailing and farming led to better trade and bigger agricultural surpluses. The Abbasids also benefited from mathematical advancements that they made themselves and that they developed in this kind of relationship with India. India is traditionally a very advanced part of the world in mathematics. And again, when cultures trade ideas and know-how, everybody benefits. And the Abbasids knew this, and so great advancements in mathematics under the Abbasids. The Abbasids also benefited from Hellenistic learning. If you recall back to Project 2, the Hellenistic world reached all the way into Eastern Persia, and so you've got all these Greek books and Greek learning throughout the Muslim world, and the Abbasids took advantage of that learning and expanded on it and pushed it forward. And this was at a time when the Europeans were in the Dark Ages and basically living in dirt and filth, right? The Abbasids are making great advancements in the STEM fields. Although eventually the Abbasids declined as well. Continued divisions between Sunni and Shi'a Muslims just put a lot of strain on the empire. As we see, once again, their rulers became corrupt. They became lazy. They started to depend more on eunuchs to run their government. The caliphs just started to spend more time with their harems. And a harem is a Middle Eastern word for a group of concubines. The Persian elements within the Abbasid Caliphate became stronger. They just started charging their people too much in taxes, and eventually that was it. And kind of the last straw were the Mongol invasions, which we'll look at in our next project. But all that added up to the collapse of the Abbasids. And so once again, we get these invaders from the east who are kind of similar to the Abbasids themselves. And these are the Seljuk Turks. And again, the Turks were these nomadic people from, far western China, northern Afghanistan, and up. And these are horse people. I refer to that area as the stands, right? Because that's the modern region that includes Tajikistan and Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan and all these other, I call them the stands for short. But so these Seljuk Turks are related to the Mongols, and they're also related to our old friends, the Scythians and the Xiongnu. So once again, we have these nomadic horse people coming from this part of the world and exerting great pressure on the civilized world. We've seen it with the Chinese. We're now seeing it with the Muslims. In the next project, we're going to see it on the Europeans. These horse people that come out of this part of the world were very disruptive in world history. And the Seljuk Turks would go on to conquer and unite most of the central Muslim world, right? Mesopotamia, the Levant, Egypt, and eventually they would kind of merge and reform, and they would become the Ottoman Turks. And remember, the Ottoman Empire lasts all the way up until the late 19 teens at the end of World War I. So this would be a very, very long-term important change in world history. Under the Abbasids, we see a kind of climax of Muslim art and learning, at least in this time period, right? I mean, the Abbasids provided a very stable caliphate, and it was large and multicultural and had a lot of different influences, including Indian and Hellenistic and Roman influences. And the Abbasid scholars were free from religious and political interference and kind of free to do their work. And so that's part of why the STEM fields and literature and art became so great during this time period. But eventually, as we're going to see in Europe as well, the religious leaders, the so-called ulama, who are the religious scholars in Islam, particularly Sunni Islam, they were suspicious of a lot of this learning and ideas because it was foreign. And particularly the learning that came from the Hellenistic world. I mean, these are, the Greeks were pagans. And so the ulama kind of pushed back against a lot of this learning, and Islam kind of had this upsurge of faith over reason. And again, we see this in medieval Europe as well. In Europe, during the medieval period, there's a shift from religion towards science. The reverse happens in the Muslim world. There's a shift from science towards religion, and that would damage the Abbasid Caliphate, and I would argue damage the Muslim world as they started to slip behind China and India and even Europe in their STEM learning. Also, out of this time period, we get a movement in Islam known as Sufism, or the people who practice it were called the Sufis. And the Sufis emphasized the more emotional nature of Islam. Again, this is very much like that debate in medieval Christianity, whether one should follow their emotions or their reason. And the Sufis definitely emphasized emotion, and they were known for their exotic dancing and music, the so-called whirling dervishes, and the use of drugs like hashish, which is an extremely powerful form of marijuana. These were very mystical people. They believed that you got to truth through belief and emotion, not through laws or any legalistic system. And they were generally organized into small local groups that were outside of the larger Sunni and Shia political controls. These were small independent bands of believers with a single teacher for each group. It was also during this time period that Islam began to expand eastward, particularly into a region known as the Sind, which is western India or modern-day Pakistan. And Islam was integrated into Hindu politics in India. This was particularly true in the lower castes, right? Islam has no caste system. And so this was very appealing to lower caste Hindus who were told if they became Muslim, they would become equal to everyone. So for the untouchables and the other lower Hindu castes, we can see how this was very appealing. There was also an adoption of Indian culture by the Arab conquerors. So some of these Arab conquerors and Persian conquerors moved into India and remained Islam but became Indian in culture. We see this particularly among the Rajas, who were Indian kings who were Islam in religion. And so Islam has experienced a long and important history in India. As I said, it was much more popular with the lower castes or classes. But Islam also helped to convert Buddhists, especially by the Sufis, who again emphasize the more emotional part of Islam. This is much more appealing to the Buddhists. And the Muslims made peace with the high caste Hindus, who they needed for imperial administration and science and medicine. So very often in some of these Indian kingdoms you have a Muslim ruler, but then all of the power players within the kingdom are high caste Hindus. And so later on this would open the door for the Brahmin, who are the high caste Hindus, to take control once again. And so, like I said, this set about later on a Hindu resurgence in India, right? Because Islam was a foreign religion, and so the reorganization of the Brahmin, led to Hinduism becoming much more powerful and Islam becoming less powerful. This was also due to local cults that were rooted in older Vedic traditions. And so eventually there was a kind of stable, even if it was uneasy, peace between Islam and Hinduism. Finally, we look at the spread of Islam into Southeast Asia. Traders and Sufi, we could maybe even call them missionaries, helped spread Islam as far into the Pacific as the Philippines. In fact, Indonesia now has the largest Muslim population in the world by numbers, not by percentage, of any nation on earth, right? I mean, other countries have a higher percentage of Muslims, but in absolute numbers, Indonesia is the biggest Muslim country on earth. And so that's it. Thanks for watching. And again, this was part 2 of a 3-part series. Thank you.